Right, here we go.
So Spring MongoDB introduction. And here, because most folks have actually used MongoDB, I'm not going to spend too much time. To simplify this introduction, I've used a guide that's actually on the web, and I've also included it in a GitHub project. But essentially, it was written in plural site, and essentially, it just talks about it's a students database which manages students and all the CRUD functions that are related to students: add, remove, increment scores, and so on. So there's lots of functions that actually are exposed here. Some of the things that I didn't expose and didn't talk about, essentially, somewhere in here, he talks about creating a user. I didn't mention that in Spring because you cannot create users in Spring. This is something you do at the management level, or you do that in MongoDB, or at least you should. So anyway, so that's something that I will not expose in terms of code. And I've also kept a copy of this in a local GitHub because it's open source. Obviously, and because I'm mentioning it, I guess I'm sort of abiding by their license. Long story short, if you cannot find it, let's say that plural site link goes dead, obviously we'll still have it with us. Everything that I've taken from MongoDB or from plural site, I saved locally. Code, everything. So if they go away, unless I also go away, then obviously this code should exist, or unless GitHub goes away, I suppose. Anyway, so MongoDB is a mouthful. This stuff. High performance, high availability, and automatic scaling. What I like about MongoDB, and the reason why I switched to MongoDB is this document. It looked too appealing to me at the time because it has this JSON-esque stuff. And in cybersecurity, data is essentially as dynamic as anyone's imagination. So obviously, we couldn't have a static schema like SQL. SQL is very, at least in this case, is very harsh. You have to know what it is that you're going to put in. And obviously, a document database allowed us to simply just not even have to think about this. Actually, we have to think in reverse. How in the hell are we going to extract this data? What's in there? So obviously, that's the discovery part. The pain comes later. So there are advantages, obviously. You have documents, they correspond to objects, you have embedded, you can include embedding, and you have this thing called a schema that has fluent polymorphism. That's nice. So essentially, this is sort of what it means. It's one of those, I took this from the source, I think it was in, I think it was here, Stack Overflow. Someone explained what it means, essentially. So you can read this, I guess, later. But essentially, it's kind of like objects, where you have a basic car and you can have a sports car, essentially. So this allows you to have, essentially, dynamic schema. So you can have, when you insert data, sometimes you can insert very little, and sometimes a lot more. And then when your data gets transformed to your actual objects, you're not going to have any failures when you convert from JSON to JSON, when you go back and forth. So essentially, you're going to have a bunch of nulls, unless, of course, you say they shouldn't be null. I should have the ID, I suppose. But obviously, MongoDB will complain before you will. So MongoDB does not allow null IDs. Now, when you install MongoDB, various ways: yum, apt-get, tarball, or use a Mac. Obviously, Mac also has complicated ways, but I just like brew. Makes it simpler. It's all added to my class path, and I'm done. I mean, to my system path. Sorry. Windows. If you like Windows, all I can say is good luck to you. But obviously, there's an installer for that, as they say. But Windows is one of those nightmares. I've used Windows since version 3, and I've dealt with all the nightmares that Windows comes with: the registry, the whatevers, and the shells, the ever-changing command line environments. So MSI, disabling MSI, the Windows whatever script host, these things are sometimes enabled, sometimes they're disabled, because especially virus checkers, if you happen to have something as beautiful as a McAfee, your MSI installers fail. So that's why I say good luck, because you might as well simply take that computer and switch it to a Mac. But once installed, make sure the bin directory is in the path, And the two most popular commands you're going to be using are MongoD and Mongo. Unless, of course, you've used the package manager, something like yum or apt-get, and it just took care of all these things for you, meaning you just started it. In MongoD, you don't have to type MongoD, which is what I had to do essentially in this environment for demo purposes. So essentially in here, you can see the MongoD is running, with all its mighty warnings. This access control is not enabled for this database. Ooh, you better be afraid, because I suppose hackers know. Anyway, and of course the default port on MongoDB is 27017. So if you don't know this by now, obviously Google will help you, so you don't have to remember this port. If you haven't enabled MongoD as a daemon or as a Windows service, obviously you have to just type it in, either by, if it's in a path or not, you just have to use a fully qualified path. And Mongo has a very beautiful command line interface where things are very standardized, and -- port is one of the most popular options you'll have to remember in your life when you're not using the standard port. So when you run MongoD, let's say if I run MongoD in here, I have Docker, see if Docker is running, and let's look at Kinetic because it'll be the simplest thing. So I think this thing is running, right? If it looks green, it looks green. So okay, so if I do this, obviously I connect it to a Docker, and I can show, so I'm doing stuff, so obviously I connected to that particular version of MongoDB. But if I don't do -- port, obviously it tries to connect locally. So this is what I mean by these sort of instructions here. For the most part, you'll do MongoD and Mongo. When you run locally, it tells you that it runs locally because it says, there's no home like, 127.0.0.1, I suppose. So that's what that does. And again, these warnings show up all the time. If you run in a really complex environment, you're going to see NUMA, and that's another nice warning that you'll have to deal with in those multiprocessor worlds. List all databases. You can show the DBs, and by default, it shows obviously the sizes. To create a new database, there's no such word as create. You use, and unless you do something to this database, that database will not exist, even though it said use. It just doesn't exist until something is committed to it. If you want to figure out where you are, except of course if you happen to be in a foreign land, at least in MongoDB, this helps. You can type DB. It will not help you if you happen to be in Holland. But moving forward, if you want to look at a MongoDB document, obviously you cannot pick one of those binaries and look at it. You can, but it's just not going to look like this. It's going to look like any binary file out there because they're BSON or whatever, the binary JSON format of JSON. But this is a typical thing that you might see, obviously now with these names, in MongoDB. Arrays look like arrays in JSON. Embedded documents look like, well, that. Now, if I wanted to create a collection, we can create one like this. So let's just pick this and essentially, let's say we want to create a collection. And I guess this would be a good time to show some of these IDEs. So for example, let's just use, has anybody used the Mongo Chef? And right now, that it's called something like Studio 3T, yeah. Right? What a really unusual name. But anyway, so for example, in here, you can see that you have these databases, right? In this case, IMW. So for example, if I wanted to go in here, and if I wanted to create a collection, obviously I can create collection, right? So I can simply, the same as the command that I had there, I can simply use this, and I can just call it foo, and then hopefully foo showed up, and this would be the equivalent, obviously, this would be the equivalent of this. Now, obviously, you probably wanted to use the command line, I suppose, but if you happen to be in a hurry and you happen to have some disposable cash, Studio 3T is probably the tool to use. If you're using Studio 3T for personal use, the folks in Germany, I think, they tell you that you can use it for free. But you have to promise that you do not use it for profit. So essentially, if it's personal, then it's personal. There are some beautiful tools that this tool does, is that one of the things that it does, it allows you to do aggregation. So for example, if I pick a collection, any collection, let's say this one, I can do aggregation, you know, and it helps me with aggregations. Another thing that it does, it helps you copy paste. So for example, if you go in here, let's go to the web. Let's go to see if we go here, aggregation with MongoDB from the folks at MongoDB, which by the way, my examples on aggregation are based on this, and this is mentioned in the GitHub project. So for example, if I go here and I find the SDJUG collection, right? So if I go here in zip codes and I want to aggregate in here and I paste this. Now, paste is a bit difficult. Sometimes I just simply use the button, because otherwise if I paste, it's going to try to rename my collection to that aggregation syntax, and trust me, I don't think it's going to work. So now I can paste it in here. Now the beauty is that another good part about this is that you can actually obviously double click and look at the syntax. I mean, that's really exciting, but probably not. But if you wanted to disable sections, you can simply say, hey, disable this from the pipeline. So that's cool. Now when I write this, when I run this, now I can see without that syntax. Another thing you can do, you can now copy it into the into the clipboard, and you can look at it. And they do some funky stuff when they disable. So you can actually see they restructure the syntax for you. They tell you stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Especially with complicated aggregations, things get out of hand. So one of the things that I do, if I write things by hand, I paste them into Studio 3T, and then I copy the restructured version. And then I can see how it actually made things into stages for me. And what I do later, essentially, I go to the code, and I did this in here too, to show as an example. Let's see if we have that in here. I guess it's part of Mongo. And so for example, if I go to the zip repository, what I do, I paste that in here. And I'm going to do one of those zooms, which will not show up in the video. So see, when I aggregate, I show the original and how I did it in Spring. You know, so and because, like I said, Studio 3T arranges the code as opposed to me. It kind of formats it so I can just paste it in. So essentially, that's what Studio 3T does. Now, the latest version of Studio 3T does SQL. So you can actually do SQL syntax. So obviously, if you're so accustomed to SQL and you don't like this sort of nonsensical JSON querying, which I'm actually very used to by now, but if you're not used to it, if you come from SQL, well, how in the hell do I do a select? You know, so you can do that with Studio 3T. You know, and by the way, if you work for a company, obviously you can get it 1 month free. I don't work for them, by the way. I'm not doing advertising. I'm trying to show you the tool. So another tool was RoboMongo. You know, it sounds like somebody's doing a robbery, but the folks in Germany figured that out and renamed this thing to, I think, if I look here, I think they renamed it to Robo 3T. You know, so there's this version of it. You know, so obviously in here, there's, you know, ooh, now it's easier, you know, I suppose. So if you knew RoboMongo, now you have to remember this new 3T name. Essentially, what the Robo does, I suppose, it allows you to do code completion. So for example, if I go and try to run a query on something in here, you can see that I can do db dot, and it shows me what's out there. So it allows me to code complete. At least it gives me a sense of sanity to some extent, you know. So at least, oh, look at that. So something does exist. And okay, fine, okay, great. I can close this. Does this do anything? Another, if I hit this, oh, look at that, split panes. So this allows you to run multiple queries concurrently. So you can actually see what happens if you put one query with a qualifier, suppose where you try to have a where clause versus one without it, sorting, not sorting, to see kind of how things look like. When you try to analyze your data, this split pane does help. when say ascending, descending, go ahead.
Oh, the other one, 3T, actually has a split view too, so you can run multiple.
Oh yeah, I guess I didn't figure it out. Okay. Oh, okay. So just to repeat that for the video, Studio 3T, aka Mongo Chef, has that too, the split pane. Okay. In other news, anyway, I'm going to go back to this. Anyway, thank you. So, create collection. Now, to list all the collections, you can show collections. And I've showed the IDs to some extent. And I'll probably revisit them as we go through the code examples. But like I said, use Robo 3T if you do a lot of aggregations. It's going to save you a lot of time, because essentially when you write a huge aggregation, you can have the pipeline and obviously the stages in the pipeline. And at some point, you'll see nothing. You'll run your first stage, second stage, and finally the 20th stage, and then nothing turns up. It's like, what in the hell just happened? You don't want to delete code. You can just disable sections and then walk your way backwards. And then hopefully you figure out that you just simply mistyped a word. Sprung versus spring, that sort of thing, where you kind of just simply type something wrong. And obviously, that's where you went wrong. Hopefully, it's that easy. MongoDB can be difficult with the syntax. Again, later, I can have a session on MongoDB, but that will be very MongoDB-centric. So the sort of the dead community of MongoDB in San Diego, maybe it can revive itself, and maybe we can have sessions on that. Anyway, after you set things up, maybe you want to figure out what's going on with MongoDB. MongoStats is a way to do that. And for whatever reason, they made it human unreadable by default. So maybe they were thinking that no human in the world will ever use this tool. So they added the -- human readable, where you have to say true, apparently. Because otherwise, if you say human readable, it probably assumes false. So anyway, it's something like a VM-stat, where you can figure what's going on in there with Mongo, like the writes, the reads, and so on, I suppose. And Mongo Top is a tool that actually, by default, refreshes every second. And probably that's not something you have in mind, because things are really going to fly off the screen almost immediately. If you have something that's simply woodpeckering the database, things will just be, what the hell is happening? I don't even know. So maybe you want to slow things down a little bit. So 15 seconds perhaps is slow enough for you to realize that somebody's really woodpeckering the database. And what are they doing? What are they inserting so fast? And obviously, I don't know if you noticed, but if you do that, if you take Mongo, and if you want to kill Mongo very fast, you could just simply run a while loop and just insert one item at a time. And just see how Mongo simply just steals your processor. Nothing works except smoke. So essentially, that's kind of how Mongo dies fast, I suppose. But that's not the fault of Mongo. It's just something that you shouldn't do. And we'll talk about that in the next slides. Sorry. Okay. So for example, if I exit this, and now I go to Spring Boot MongoDB. Okay. Now I chose this one. The other thing that I have is aggregation. So if we have time, we'll go to aggregations. Now, when you use Mongo, I'm losing my mind, I guess, if I haven't already. It's pretty good Mongo. There are a lot of queries that you have to run. And if we go to the examples that were actually showed in here, so for example, if we go here, by the way, I don't always have this many tabs, but for whatever reason, it opened that many. I think every time I click on one, it opens 3 or 4. So anyway, so for example, when you run essentially in this, if you look at this examples here, let's consider a student record, and this individual's name is Praveen Kumar, and essentially he's showing an example. And he's trying to create the user. Like I said, we don't mention that. Creates the collection. And now if he wants to insert a student, he does this stuff. This is the equivalent of Spring Save, in case you've ever used Spring data, MongoDB. Essentially, it takes this and saves it as is. And I'll show that in examples. But I wanted to show like the queries that I based my examples on. And as I showed earlier, and I apologize for the tab, the alt tab zippiness here. In here, all the queries that you've seen there essentially are highlighted here too. So for example, the equivalent of this particular query is essentially insert student, and obviously student is an object, you know. And because I'm not a huge fan of typing stuff like new student, student.name or .setName equals foo. What I did in a test, and we can see that in here, and by the way, for everything that I did here, we also have our beloved JUnits. So for example, for student tests, what I did, I'm using a JSON file. So essentially I'm loading that from the class path. And by the way, this is Spring. You know, Spring does this. And this is one of those instances when you want to import Spring, but not enable Spring, so to speak. You're using Spring as an API. So this would be one instance. But obviously because it's Spring Boot app, I'm not disabling anything. But essentially, in here I'm just loading a class path. I'm getting the file, passing it into a file, and I'm using commons to read the file into a string. And essentially, I wrote these utils for you guys. They're also here, where you can look at what from JSON looks like if you haven't used Jackson before. You know, so this is what it looks like. A bunch of sort of generics in here. And this can just convert from any class essentially to, I mean, from any JSON to any class, I suppose. You know, so this code is also in the GitHub. And if I go back, let me see if I can debugulate this. This is insane. Okay, so if I just simply do this. Anyway, so in here, I can simply, essentially, this is a finder, repository, find by name, this, okay. And then I'm inserting a student. So if, for example, if that name is null, I suppose, I'm doing a sort of a double take of this. Obviously, this is not something you want to do in production for every student. You want to run 2 queries. Obviously, that's insane. Remember when I mentioned the woodpecker in the database? This would be such a code, you know? So essentially, you can imagine for every insert, you have 2 things that happen, 2 queries. So that's not really cool. But in here, for test purposes, that's okay, because at least it proves what's going on. And there's no true false here. So obviously, this test will always pass, because there's no truthiness to it. Right? I'm not seeing anything that says true or false. But later on, I think I do true or false somewhere. I hope I do. Okay, look at that. I have asserts. So in not all of them I use asserts to assert something. I just wanted to show you how to use the API. So essentially I use JUnit as a means to demonstrate how to use this API. But anyway, okay. So the first thing you want to do before you do anything, you want to set up Mongo template. Mongo template is based on Mongo operations, which is the interface. So you can still use Mongo operations, but for the most part, you'll be using Mongo template. Every time you Google, you're going to be far more successful by Googling Mongo template. How do I do with Mongo template than how to do with Mongo operations? You know, it's a hit or miss. Sometimes you have to Google twice. Now, the first thing you'll have to do, obviously, you have to do something to this effect, where you have to say, hey, what's the database? And as you can see here, I didn't use properties, but this would be a good point for SDJUG to be a property, somehow defined in application properties or somewhere else. Another thing that if you go to the reference documentation from Spring, they tell you to return new Mongo, not Mongo client. And you'll get a deprecation warning on Mongo. You have to use Mongo client. Mongo client has many constructors, one of which is empty, like this one. And essentially, if you want to have your model in a specific package, this would be the way to do it. Otherwise, it's anywhere. And sometimes when that happens, obviously, auto-scanning slows things down, especially in startup. If you want to start using the Mongo template, I think that's all there is to it, at least in a non-XML world. And you probably notice that I don't use XML. And you probably know if you use Spring Boot that XML is a big no-no in Spring Boot because it's disabled. You have to do all sorts of things to enable it. And Spring keeps saying no. You know, it's like saying no to drugs. XML sort of should be in the same bag. You know, you shouldn't sniff any XML because it'll cause pain. And especially Spring Boot really specifies that to some extent. It simply makes it hard for you to sniff any XML. And for the most part, Mongo template is all you'll ever need. And you can go home and simply be happy and watch Arrow reruns, I suppose, during the summer. But if things, you know, right now, this is all you need to do. When you enable a zip repository, you have a lot of things that are enabled by default. Now, Spring, as Spring always does, it has many versions of interfaces. You have repository, and you have some other repositories. So as you keep going down, you figure out that the ultimate, at least in this case, is paging and sorting repository, because for some reason, this repository exposes everything there is to expose to a Spring repository, including paging and sorting. So that's the reason why I use the paging and sorting. I could have used a repository, but then it only exposes what the repository exposes. And I'm not so sure if I don't think I mentioned that. I'll mention that in a link where it shows all the categories of repositories and sort of kind of driving you to the ultimate. Why not simply go straight to the ultimate? Why simply mess with your mind? But what happens when all the things are enabled by Spring, and there are quite a few things that are enabled by default. You have find all, there's a naming convention that allows you to kind of find by city, and it'll say, oh, find by city. Oh, look at that. You have to have a city in your model, so Sim is going to find by city, and then you're going to add a sort, and obviously whatever the sort does, it sorts the cities by that sort. But some things will not be there. Aggregations will not be there. There's no way in hell Spring can figure out what the hell you're going to do with aggregations. So obviously you have to extend repositories. Now, when I first used Spring Data, I didn't know about these repositories. So essentially I used a DAO model. Now the problem with DAO is that it's completely disconnected from your repository. So that's why in Spring, maybe you want to group things by the type you're about to extend. And that's exactly what I'm about to say here. So when you add a custom behavior, essentially you create an interface and an implementation, and I'll show you that in here. You create your custom. Now the naming convention is really important here, because if you don't do this naming convention, you'll have to use annotations to override those, and they're not easy, so I'm not going to mention them. But they're essentially, there's some ungodly ways to simply make Spring read your non-conventional names. But essentially, if you follow this, it's like eeny, meeny, miny, moe. You're going to find things eventually. But essentially, you have a zip repository custom, which is your interface. And then you have a zip repository impl. Notice how impl kind of complies with this. You see zip repository and zip repository impl. Now Spring, when it sees that you extend zip repository custom, it's going to have an aha moment. It's going to go for the impl method, for the impl class. So essentially now when you do my repository dot, suddenly things happen. You could have your aggregation methods. And I'll show that in code. So if I go here, in here, for example, we essentially enabled a students repository. And maybe this is a good point to mention some of these find by names. As you can see, there's a naming convention. So if I do find by name, I can just pass the name. So now Spring, by default, you see, I didn't type any code. There's no code. If I do something, if I try to open there's no code. This is it. It does it at runtime. So it simply looks, oh, look at that. I'm going to look for a field called name. If I type in name 2, if I try to save this, I think Spring is going to pick up as an error. It's going to say, hey, there's no name 2. Now, you're dreaming. There's no such thing. So obviously, it's going to try to look at your model. So it does an introspection on your model. So it's easy for you to pick up. Again, that's why XML was no good, because you couldn't pick up type exceptions and type errors. In here, obviously it's Java code. Spring does introspection in your code, and it just simply exposes that as an exception, /error, saying there's no such thing as naming your model for something called student. And when you create an interface, a repository, obviously you have to mention the model and the type for your ID. I probably forgot to mention this, but this is probably important. So it's worth mentioning, because if you put in something that is not true in here, you're going to have some really interesting headaches. So anyway, but that's what's going to happen. So essentially find by name. So there are all these fancy methods that you can actually deal with. As you can see, you can do all sorts of things where you can actually do replacement. So you can actually even have a query DSL, I suppose. And it simply says, I'm trying to replace this field, I suppose, with that. Actually, this is the selector. So this is the same as when you do a projection. I don't know if you're familiar with projection in MongoDB, but you can say, I only want to display this and that. And everything else I don't want to display. Because if it's a big data model that maybe in this particular query they're going to be nulls or irrelevant, then I can just simply say, all I want is name and email. Technically, you should put comma ID equals 0 if you don't want to see that. Because by default, Mongo, that's like a little whack-a-mole. It always shows ID. So if you don't want to see it, you can also say, you have to say, I suppose, 0 to that. And then in here, it simply just does, much like in SQL, when you use the SQL statements with question marks, it's going to replace name for name, I suppose. So this is, and by the way, as you probably noticed, I put links on everything, right? So you can see where I took these from. Those are straight from the documentation. But again, when it comes to stuff that is perhaps custom, let's say, for example, I wanted to do a bulk insert. Spring doesn't know what that means. Although it actually exposes the methods, it doesn't know what bulk insert means. So for example, if I look at what bulk insert means, at least as far as I'm concerned, it sort of looks like this. And once again, I'm doing one of those zooms. So essentially, this is what a bulk insert looks like. Now, I'll explain that in a second, but I can even mention it now, and I'll simply speed through the slides. Essentially, what bulk insert allows you to do, it allows you to deal with duplicates when you insert. In my case, when I insert lots of cybersecurity data, and I mean lots of things happen essentially every second, so I get lots of data. And cybersecurity data has a way of overlapping. Essentially, it gets, even though it's only mentioned once, when I run a query, the time junctions overlap. Even though I say between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 4 and 5, and so on and so forth, I get overlap of data. I get data that was actually from the previous hour. So I get duplicates all the time. This is one way to deal with it. I don't want to reinsert the data that was inserted before. I only want to insert the data that I want to insert now. So for example, if I receive 10 records and only 5 are worth inserting, that's what's going to happen with this. If I use this one, I think there's another method here. Let's see if I can, okay, it's not easy. If I use insert students, I think there's a one in here. Okay, if I use this Mongo template.insert students, guaranteed, it'll fail every time. And essentially, it's going to try to insert and then, oops, duplicate. Good night. And good luck to you all, I suppose. Because that's not going to work from that point on. So essentially, you want to use something like bulk insert, which is, by the way, supported from command line. When you go into the shell or any tool, this would work without a headache. But in Spring, by default, it doesn't. So you have to write your own bulk operations. Another thing worth mentioning in bulk operations, this is another way to save your inserts instead of, or operations. So let's say you wanted to do a bunch of things all at once. In here, you can essentially give this bulk ops. And by the way, to avoid duplicates, you have to make sure it's unordered. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Duplicates will still be thrown as exceptions. You're going to get somewhere in here, I suppose, or maybe here. I'm not so sure. But anyway, so if this is ordered, it's going to try to keep things ordered, and it's going to say, oh, I see, you were a strict kind of guy, so I'm simply not going to allow duplicates. But as you can see here, you can actually do multiple operations. And then essentially you can execute, in this case I'm only executing one, but you could have multiple operations. You can do update, delete, insert again. And essentially you can just tell Mongo to do that. And by the way, you're going to have problems with aggregations with this one. So when you do bulk operations with aggregations, at least in Spring, you're going to get a lot of unsupported exceptions. So you just have to figure out what is supported in the latest version of Spring. So with aggregations, you'll have to figure out, like, essentially, let's say sort maybe is not supported, something. It'll give you an exception because it's trying to formulate the query, but it doesn't know how to formulate the query. And somehow it gets a format exception, and it throws it back to you. It's just the way Spring is implemented bulk operations, and somehow it doesn't always do the right thing. So I guess don't use it all the time. But at least for this case, if you want to deal with duplicates, this would be a good use for bulk operations. Okay, back to the interfaces. So now, as you can see, let's say if I go let's just say where somebody, let's see who's using this thing. So for example, in here, oh, sorry, trying to, okay. So for example, in here, as you can see, I'm using repository dot, right? So as you can see, it figured out that it's part of repository. And if I try to see, it actually, as you can see, it says it came from custom, right? Even though when I look at repository, at the definition of repository, it came from repository. But if I look at its hierarchy, you can see that it figures out that it's repository, it's a paging and sorting, CRUD repository. Remember when I mentioned that the ultimate, there's 3 of them? You can do repository, CRUD repository, paging. Obviously use this guy because it simply it shows all the functionality that you can get from a repository in Spring. But look at that, my repository also has functionality from this interface. So right now I can figure out what this repository can do. Okay, so essentially this is what this means. And now the beauty of this is it is grouped by type. So you know for sure, like you're not going to try to scratch your head, what does this DAO do again? Because in DAO you can be very wild. You know, you can do things for various types. You can say, you can write a DAO that simply deals with all the types in the world. For students, for professors, for beggars, you can simply put it all in one DAO. And when somebody says, how do I deal with beggars, I suppose, you don't know. You know, you say, well, I think it's somewhere in the DAO. I think it's towards the middle, as everything happens to be. You know, you simply say, if you know, like a binary search, just look in the middle first, you know, and maybe that's not your best luck, I suppose. But in this case, you know for sure that all students' queries would be in this group of classes. Okay, so another thing that Spring wanted to mention, this is not a bean. I mean, this is not a Spring data thing. So it can be a bean. It can be just a normal bean. You can insert even JDBC template, I suppose. You can really mix it up if you wanted to. So they're saying it's just a regular bean. So you can do whatever you want. And obviously in here I put the link on custom implementation for Spring repositories, which also mentions the annotations, which I mentioned, they're a bit tricky. Now, if you insert a single student, as I mentioned, which is the equivalent of something that was mentioned here, this would be the equivalent, I suppose. That's it. And obviously if you're doing a duplicate, and that's a good point that I have to bring up, because if I deal with a student, and I'm going to go to a student class, because in the model, when I define a class, I have to do some annotations. And once again, I'm doing a zoom, which probably is not visible, but I mean a student.java class. The annotations help you define things. So when I define a document by default, it takes the name of the class, you know. But if I want to override that, I can simply say this collection should be students, you know. Another thing that I can do, obviously, I can define my ID if it's not called ID. Another thing I can do is I can add indexes by default, text index. So if I look at this particular index, essentially, it's probably not the easiest way to do this, so I'm going to try to zoom out, otherwise I'm going to lose my mind. So if I look here, I can see this index, you know. So for example, I can see what Spring did by default. And if you look at the text options, you can see the weight is 1 by default. If you want to give a different weight, obviously you have to mention the weight. But by default, maybe this is what you wanted to do. You want to search everything should be treated equal. So when I type foo, look everywhere equally and return me the result. But if you want to add more weight, you know, essentially, let's say to email, so when somebody types an email, you want to add weight to email, you do that. But by default, it picks a weight of 1 when you type this. But obviously, you can, once you open the paren, you can see what other options you may have. You know, weight happens to be one of them. You know, so again, the beauty of this is that you don't have to create indexes by hand. You know, because Spring doesn't offer such a method. Oh, by the way, as you probably noticed, I saved, and it's just restarting the server. You know, that's one of those annoying instances of dev tools, right? Beautiful. Right now, if I wanted to access, I'll have to wait until this thing reloads. So essentially, that's all I have to say about that, I suppose. Quoting Forrest Gump. Another thing you can do, when you insert students, you can override the collection name. By default, because it's an at document, when you pass this without the collection, it simply introspects the document, and this is going to go to students. And obviously, in here, I'm inserting in the same collection, because otherwise you're going to try to figure out, why did I put it in a different collection? I put it in the same collection, but I wanted to at least show that you can override that. And in here, obviously, there's some sort of static constant or something. It's obviously a variable that probably just mentions the same collection. But I wanted to at least show that you can do that too. So if, for example, during test, you have a bunch of classes, that you want to, a bunch of definitions of collections that you want to override. Let's call it the students dev, you want to test. Or if you use embedded Mongo, and by the way, I haven't shown that as an example here, but you can also embed Mongo. There's a company in Germany that actually embedded Mongo, and it's written, I think, in Java, so you can actually just run Mongo embedded. And if you want to have like your test as unit test, if you wanted to test as opposed to doing integration testing, you can use the embedded Mongo, so you don't have to kind of just hook up to Mongo. But setting that up actually is an entire session. So I didn't want to do that because it would just simply take too many slides, too much explanation, I think, as far as I'm concerned, so I didn't show that. And as I mentioned earlier, but duplicates happen, right? So this is where bulk operations come in. Because the previous method is, when it comes to duplicates, it chokes. So obviously you want to do this. You want to do bulk operations. Now, text search, when you do a text search, Spring makes it easy and hard, I suppose, to some extent, because it's hard to figure this one out unless you read the documentation. I guess that goes for everything, but it's probably not so intuitive, because you have to create this criteria, and you have to mention which language. And if you want to get away easy, you can say default language, which I guess in our case would be English, or whatever your default language happens to be in your localization. If you happen to be, Romanian, I suppose, it'll pick that language, and that'll be your default. So anything they have with accents and so on, diacritics or whatever you have, it'll pick that when somebody types it. So if you type A, and in Romanian you have which is an A with a thing on top, so essentially it'll pick that up, But obviously you have to have your localization enabled. Otherwise, it won't pick it up because it has that funny looking character. And it won't pick up when I say something in Romanian, I suppose. It won't pick it up, So you have to be aware of that fact.
Is it doing some kind of close matching or something? I mean, why would it matter?
Like, I see.
Like,
Well, it does that. It's case insensitive, I think. But when it comes to a character, it doesn't match A versus A, because even though it looks alike, it doesn't. It's not the same. It's a different. Essentially, it's a different letter. As far as if you look at the Romanian alphabet, it's actually a different letter altogether. So it's not the same as about. It's whatever. I can't think of a word. But anyway, but let's put it that something begins with that letter, or should. There's a letter in Romanian language that actually has a thing like a comma at the bottom. We'll say, și am fost undeva, whatever. She is S-I, but it has this thing, so you have to pronounce it she. So when you search for SI, nothing is going to come up, because it simply didn't match against that. So that's why you have to do localization. So when you do a text search, you have to be aware of that fact, And of course, it's variant. So essentially in here, if you type 0 or more words, so you don't have to type anything, obviously not null, I suppose. But if you don't type anything, I guess nothing will be matched, I suppose. And if we show that in here, and maybe this is a good plug for Postman, in here, if I do a text search, if I search for cloud, management, 985, I suppose, and cat, and this is the stuff that would return. So if I simply zoom out, and if I send essentially, maybe something here has 985, or cat, or look at that, there's some sort of 985 here. This doesn't expand very well. Oh, here we go. and there's something cat, and there's meow meow, that sort of thing. So it matched. For example, if I run this query without these things in here, it'll not do a text search. And I'll show how the API looks like. And the only reason why I show this is because this is how you would expose to REST. And essentially right now, as you can see, this did a list all. And I'll show how I did that in Java. As I mentioned, there are many twists and turns to this presentation because I'm trying to accomplish as much as I can, and I think I'm right out of time almost, right?
Yeah.
Okay, 5 more minutes? Okay.
Everybody's in?
So in a controller, so essentially if we go to the student controller, in here I added 2 methods. So the 2 methods is post and get. And what I did here is I said, hey, let's have this text as a request param, and it's not required. So I'm not going to complain if you don't pass it to me. If I make this true, then obviously I'm going to always complain that you didn't pass it to me. So what I do, if I find that it's not blank, I'm going to do a text search. And I'm going to split this into commas, and I'm going to pass that array to the repository. Otherwise, I'm simply going to give you everything that I found. Obviously, this is probably a good time to talk about limit, but I didn't show it. I think I have examples with limit in the code. There's lots of code, by the way, in here that you can find in the repository implementation. And obviously, the test will show that. When you go inside the test for student, you can see there's quite a few lines of code. As you can see, you have delete students, find and sort, find all sorted students, and so on. And this is also a good time to talk about how to test Spring Boot. So in here, you can actually use the Spring Runner. This is the most recommended way to test Spring Boot these days. So use the Spring Runner, and if you have a special application config, you can mention that in here. Otherwise, you can simply mention the application .java, the one that actually takes care of all your Spring Boot things. But if you wanted to not enable that, you can simply override that as a context configuration is this one. And then, from here on in, everything is essentially Spring. As you can see how wired works, and essentially you're just doing Spring things. And one more thing I wanted to mention before you guys go to sleep, if you haven't already, is testing REST. Now, Spring has ways to test REST, and they're not always easy. And what they did, they made this guy available called Test REST Template. How many of you have actually tried to use REST template in a test environment? How easy was that?
It took a while.
Right? Test REST template simply takes care of all that boilerplate nonsense. And simply, you don't have to do anything. You just simply, that's it. I didn't have to do anything, except, of course, the stack of annotations, I suppose, if that counts as nothing. But in here, obviously, I'm running a Spring Runner. Again, I am overriding the application config, and voila, I'm using a random port. So this to avoid any conflicts at runtime. And I'm simply saying, hey, I'm trying to scan these base packages. And essentially, I'm duplicating stuff because I'm not using the boot application, so I'm duplicating things here. If I disable that line, I'm really going to go bold in seconds because nothing will work. I mean, it's just a nightmare. And if you don't figure that out, it's not easy to Google. Because you'll get some really funny exceptions about the servlet not being found, the environment not being essentially, because you haven't used your particular application. But then, the beautiful thing is that from here on in, everything you've come to love, I suppose, and hate about the REST template works exactly as desired. REST template, get for object, students, list, string class. I'm doing an out, sys out. Beautiful. I'm using Java 8. Hey, check it out. Anyway, so I'm asserting it's Java code from here on in, And like I said, there's no more dancing around REST template in test mode. And I guess in here, I'm also doing the text search test. So in here, I'm trying to stuff this REST template with a bunch of words, I suppose. So I'm putting the variables in there, I'm simply just passing it, and I probably forgot this, so this is a problem. So don't look there. Obviously, I typed this code as fast as I could. If you look at the dates, some of them are actually as early as today, I think. Yeah, 17. So that was actually yesterday. So maybe I made some typos here, but you get the idea. And I even tested the post. And again, I'm loading from the class path, and I'm posting. So again, I'm trying to show how you automate things and test. So for example, if we were to run this, because I think it does, and I think I'm going to be done after this, sorry, trying to get out of this thing. So if I run this as JUnit, if I run it, if we're lucky enough, it should say that it passed. But again, as you can see, I was already running the project, and I left that purposely running. As you can see, it's not going to collide with it. And it's not going to say I couldn't start it, and it shouldn't, hopefully. Right? Lots of prayers going on right now. But essentially, okay, so it did collide. Probably because I'm doing the dev. Okay, so yeah, so it's colliding because I'm overriding some, and so I guess I've enabled, because I've enabled dev, essentially, so I have to shut it down because I've enabled the dev environment. So essentially, I have to run that test by hand right now because I didn't realize that I was running that. But essentially, if I run the tests right now, they will not collide. You know, so essentially, this is now trying to essentially do post, get, text search. It's going to try to do all that stuff through JUnit. So essentially, it'll just start. Again, it's very slow because it's trying to reload the environment. And this is also a good point to mention. When you run Spring tests, don't try to run each unit as its own Spring environment because it's going to be as slow as loading Spring every time. Try to make this a suite, I suppose. This would be where you invoke your suite of tests as opposed to unit tests. And hopefully JUnit kind of passed, hopefully. So it ran 3 methods, test post, you know, and so on and so forth. So it's essentially something called example test and text search. So essentially ran all these tests. See how far was I in the presentation? Text search, aggregation methods. Okay, so this is kind of where it ran out. But again, the examples show, this is what the code looks like, and this is the last example I'll show, because essentially it repeats from here on in. This is your pipeline. This is your stage 1. This is your stage 2. You're grouping by state and city, and you're summing on population. Then you're taking the result of this, and you're saying, hey, now group by ID.state and average the population with this alias name. To do that in Spring, it's as easy as this. Maybe not so obvious. I mean, sometimes when you look at the documentation, this doesn't become so obvious. Obviously, you can see it's a static import. These are static methods. So in here, I don't have a method called group myself. I'm using aggregation.group. And then you can simply optimize. And I think IntelliJ does that by default, whereas in Spring, you have to do Control-Shift-M or Command-Shift-M in Mac, or something like that, where it just simply optimizes that into a static import. And it says group by state and city, sum, population as pop, group ID, average. And I give you another tidbit here. Allow disk use to true. Now, how many people have actually run into that memory problem where the result was larger than 16 megs? You know, this is what this helps you. That's swapping. So it allows you to have results that are larger. Aggregations tend to return large results, especially if you're going against something like a CyberSecurity database where you have billions of records, and suddenly you're just returning too much. So essentially, this just does swapping. You know, obviously, it's probably you have to optimize your query. Obviously, if you get into that situation, but at least this allows you to not fail. So essentially, you're passing the options. If you go into the queries, essentially this would be allow disk use equals true. But in Spring, you have to kind of jump out of the stage. So you have to close the aggregation, and then you have to do dot with options, new aggregation options, dot allow disk use true, and then you build. So that's sort of the way to do that. Okay, so, and I think I talked about unit testing, testing endpoints. Okay, so I talked about that. And the next session, which we obviously cannot cover, would have been the aggregation itself, where I would have talked about aggregation. But again, last time I mentioned this, all that is mentioned in here. So everything that you want to do, and essentially here, it's It's mentioned in here, and this is based on the aggregation with the zip code data, so this is something you can find at MongoDB, and everything that I did here is mentioned. So MongoDB doesn't even give you this particular, like the folks at Mongo didn't bother to give you this instruction, so they say, learn how to use this tool. I simply mentioned even the two syntaxes, the dash dash and the single dashes, and I tested this. So essentially, you have the data model. Essentially, this is essentially everything that you've seen at MongoDB, folks, but essentially brought over here. And then you have the code. And obviously, you can simply just clone. And if you want me to make any changes or you have any questions, send me any requests. Message me via whatever. You know, you can just simply click on that, and I can give you my business cards, or you can simply send pictures in here, and hopefully one of them will hit me. You know, and that's the end of that. Any questions?
Great, thank you. Okay, we do have time for a few questions, if anybody has any.